Hi everyone, David here, and welcome back to day 25 of building AGI from scratch. My apologies for being off from a decently short hiatus, but yeah, now we're back on track. So today, my work has been building agents. And so I know there's a ton of ways people define agents, and the way I see it is a simple formula. So agents equal tools plus reasoning plus autonomy. Now, each part of the equation is critical. So essentially, you have the brain, that is the ability to think. And in this case, this is sort of realized via large language models and reasoning and a lot of the RL techniques that are involved in that. But the tools are what really make agents multimodal. So you can have tool usage that is through, say, web browsing or coding, or really there's a ton of tools that can be developed. And honestly, a lot of the times you can have agents craft their own tools. And the important part about this really is the third part of the equation, that is autonomy. So agents need to have some degree of autonomy. And so I think a lot of times, if we really envision agents to be, say, representing who you are and completing tasks for you, and this is just like a mind's eye view of how agents might work in the future, then it's definitely important that agents have access to things and remain autonomous, perhaps to a level of safety, but it's still important to consider that. And so what I did was, well, I was thinking, well, why don't we start from scratch and see how we can build an agent? So for the base reasoning model, I chose to use ChatGPT. And so first I started with building an agent with two tools. Number one, the ability to browse websites. And so basically just use Google. And number two is the ability to write some Python code. And so let's take a look at what I have. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this two-functional agent works. And so currently I have this tool selection function, which allows me to use essentially an LLM to pick whatever tools you want to use. And so I have three available tools. I have Browser Scrape, Browser Interact, and Python. So Browser Scrape allows me to access Google. Browser Interact allows me to log into like buttons, log into websites, and actually like interact with things. And Python allows me to generate some code. And so here the idea is that I want to use that to make a selection, and then so I'm going to use an LM to make a choice, and then I'll return the choice, and then from there on I can choose which function to use. And so here is the idea for executing Python code. It uses like a virtual box and ensures that there are these safe functions that you can use. And so it's currently still pretty weak compared to what existing LLMs have built in, like how ChatGPT is capable of running the code it generates, and so it actually has a similar sandbox, but probably with more tuning and more functionalities. And so this is the idea for generating code. I plug it into another LLM that is capable of generating code. So I'm prompting it as a code writer, and then I feed it into the task. And then so here is my module for opening browsers and interacting with the web. And the idea for opening browser is that I want to basically use like a library to, say, use a Chrome browser, and then I can just fiddle with that. So in terms of designing, I think the idea is to give the agent as much autonomy as possible without tampering with any security issues. And so I think in the long run, being able to have access to browsers is much more versatile than, say, making API calls. Now, there is one idea I have that is perhaps I could possibly create an agent that is just capable of solving tasks like on its own, so that maybe we can say give it access to like a certain folder, and then it'll just be able to do a bunch of coding in that folder and then be able to execute that. So that's an idea in the long run that could be pretty cool to realize. And so here I have the functionality for Google search, which is essentially just entering into Google's search engine some query, and the query is basically just the task I have. Now, to refine that, you can add additional prompting LLMs. So you can take an LLM to refine the initial prompt, and so maybe you can give it more instructions, etc. But really for Google, I think this is sufficient. And so this functionality allows us to get searching results, and interacting with website is another functionality that essentially just gives you the abilities to fill forms. But this is kind of basic, and navigating the web is really a more complicated task. So I think a better approach would be to do this with computer vision. And here is my prompting agent that I use to write queries. So given my task, the thing that I want to do, and like here, for example, is to find the best Chinese food in Champaign, Illinois, I can use this prompting agent to write up a query and feed that into Google. Yeah, so this is what I have at the moment. We can give this a test run. Okay, so I've got my terminal here. Now let's try to see what we can do by interacting with it. So it's selected the tool to browse and scrape, and it's looking for the best restaurants in Champaign, Illinois. Very positive. Okay, and so top 3 results. We've got this one result from Yelp, one result from Northwestern, and one result from another website. So this scraping agent works very nice. Now we can also test its coding capabilities. So if I just modify the task a little bit, say compute 10 factorial. So this is my new prompt, and I'm going to call that again and see how it does. So now it selected Python, and it generated code, and it successfully executed the result, which is exactly what I wanted. So very nice. Kudos to the agent. And so another idea that I want to implement before the end of the day is I want it to be able to consult other LLMs. So essentially, I mean, since an LLM inherently is pretty smart and has a ton of knowledge, so it would be a nice tool for the agent to consult an LLM. Let's try to see if we can implement that. Okay, everyone, I'm back, and now I've implemented the advisor agent. And so the advisor agent is essentially what we had previously in addition to this new functionality called LLM interaction. So this gives us the ability to consult LLMs, and essentially right now what we're doing is we're just feeding it into an API and letting the API do its work. So this is the new thing in town. We've got LLM interaction, and so essentially this is just like the default setting for prompting, and so it's the same thing as what it would have done on its own, what the LLM would have done on its own, but now we're adding it as an option, as a toolbox. So it's sort of like, oh, I can still use my brain. That's kind of funny. But yeah, I think inherently what would happen for an agent in the long run is that this self-knowledge awareness will just be like something that's going on behind the scenes. And so if you realize, okay, I know what this question is, like I have 10 factorial memorized or something, then I might be able to just pull it off the back of my head. Otherwise, I can consult the tools I have. And so this is very, I think, resemblant to how really humans work, right? We have tools that we have access to, and also we have knowledge that's in our brain, so we can directly call that knowledge or also use tools. For example, I know that 2 times 4 is 8. I don't really have to punch that into a calculator. And I know that, say, 256 times 256 is 16,384. Actually, no, that's 128 times 128. What am I talking about? But so 256 times 256 is 65536. And so I didn't need to use a calculator for that. But there are also times where I need to use a calculator to realize certain tasks, and this is exactly what an agent is doing. But now we're just adding LM interaction as another step to it. And so here we also made some modifications to the main function. And so I added this ability to select a tool. You can now use LM interaction. Woohoo. And so my new prompt is explain to me how quantum computing works, which is a great question for AI, because when you essentially feed it into an LLM, it just gives you whatever it has stored in mind, and it's like very knowledgeable, so very nice. Let's give it a try. So now I want to interact with the advisor agent. So it's selected LM interaction. And it's taking some time to load, which is okay. All right. Okay, great response here, right? Quantum computing uses quantum mechanics to process information. Got qubits, entanglement, this is how they operate. Got quantum gates, which manipulate qubits. Quantum supremacy says that quantum computers are better than classical computers at solving certain problems. Quantum algorithms take advantage of those. Yeah, so great response. Very nice, comprehensive overview. And so now my agent has 3 tools. I don't think it'll be very far from scaling that up to like 20 tools, 30 tools, but importantly, it's important to reflect on the architecture of agents and see how we can improve that, because there's this tool called Manus or Open Manus that has probably implemented everything that I've done, but really doing it from scratch and doing it yourself gives you an overview of how the architecture works and what are some things we can improve. I know around December last year, Anthropic released this tool called Claude Computer Use, and essentially uses CV for Claude to go around the web and use cursors and all that. So I think CV is an important aspect for agents, and so I think it's another part of the brain, right? You have LMs that are capable of thinking logically and thinking verbally, and then I think it's also important to include this visual component, just like the brain. So yeah, this is what I have for today. All right, so thank you for hearing my summary for today. I think in terms of future planning, I want to switch out the base model from, say, ChatGPT into actually a smaller model that's capable of doing chain of thought reasoning. So maybe like Quinn 7b or some of the new Llama models. I think really this is where small language models get to shine, because they don't need like this large redundant system and actually can be able to iterate on itself faster and be able to fine-tune itself faster. And so I think there's a lot of potential there to use as the base for the agent. And so again, going back to the agent formula, tools, reasoning, plus autonomy. All these are important components, and we'll see how we can build from here. Thank you. See you around.